Today we're going to talk about the First Amendment and freedom of speech. Some of the things that you should take away from today is that, first of all, the First Amendment has a preferred position. The Supreme Court has ruled that the First Amendment comes first, and when in conflict with other rights, tends to predominate those other rights and those other freedoms. If you don't have the freedom to believe what you want to believe, the freedom to say what you want to say, to assemble where you want to assemble, to associate with whom you want to associate, then it is difficult to have a free society. The freedom of speech can be limited by the government if it shows that it has a compelling interest, that its limit is neutral, applies to everyone equally. You can't target certain groups over others. And then it is done in the least restrictive means. If you have a compelling interest, in order to fulfill that compelling interest, then what freedoms you limit of the people need to be done as little as possible. And that compelling interest, neutrality, and least restrictive means test is a test that you should be familiar with already, because it's the same three tests that we saw when the government looks to limit the free exercise of religion. And throughout all of the Bill of Rights, we're going to be talking about tensions between social order and individual freedom. And so there are times when a government has a commitment to social order, a commitment to national security, and that might come in conflict and create tensions with our individual freedom. So the ability to say what we want to say is important, and yet words can be dangerous, and there's times when the government might have a compelling interest in order to limit them. We've seen examples in history of the government limiting free speech. One of the things that you'll actually see is that over time, our freedom of speech has grown and become more free. It's becoming more powerful liberty in individual liberty. But as early as the early founding, right after the adoption of the Bill of Rights, it says Congress shall pass no law restricting the freedom of speech, and then they are, passing the Alien and Sedition Acts. During the pre-Civil War era, the gag rule prevented the dissemination of materials that over about slavery. So one of the ways that the government tried to deal with the issue of slavery is they prevented debating about, speaking about, passing laws about slavery. During the Civil War, the post office censored information that was deemed as might be dangerous to the war effort. During World War I, the government passed the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Once again, the Sedition Act made it illegal to criticize the government, the Constitution, people in uniform. When that was challenged by the Supreme Court in Schenck versus the United States, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of that act. It is out of that we get that clear and present danger test. You probably heard the phrase that you cannot falsely shout fire in a crowded theater. Falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater would create a clear and present danger. And so there's times when if your speech creates a clear and present danger, you are not protected by the First Amendment. Were you to walk into a bank and then just shout everybody down, the First Amendment does not protect you. You can't just then laugh it off and say like, hey, I was just talking, I just said some words. No, like that, yelling everybody down as you enter into a bank or any type of secure building would create a clear and present danger. And so those words can be limited by the government. The First Amendment does not protect you. In 1969, the Supreme Court liberalized the First Amendment. They don't tend to use the clear and present danger test anymore. The clear and present danger test can be construed very narrowly. So like the government has had a lot of power in basically saying like, hey, these words can be actually dangerous. They're a clear and present danger and can be limited. Brandenburg v. Ohio created what is known as the imminent lawlessness test, meaning that the First Amendment does not protect you if what you're advocating for is you're advocating for imminent lawless action. So you are advocating for illegal action in the very near future, and it is likely to produce that action. So it added both. So again, an example would be, you and your friends are walking out on the street, not now, because you'd have to be 6 feet apart, but one of them trips you or they embarrass you in some way. And so you say, hey, I'm gonna kill you. Well, in that moment, you advocated for imminent lawless action. And yet I think we would all agree that it was not likely to produce that action. And so in that case, your freedom of speech most likely protects you, because although you advocated for imminent lawlessness, it was not likely to produce that lawlessness. We kind of all think, you all tend to know and can pick up from social cues that in that moment, it was not a true threat. And intended to be, it was more figurative than actual. There's other types of unprotected speech. Libel and slander are unprotected. Libel is written, slander is spoken. And so there are times when words can cause harm. Now, when we talk about slander, we're not just talking about saying mean things about someone. You going on Twitter and saying Mr. Patton is a terrible teacher, he's the worst. And so then my feelings get hurt, I'm crying in the corner. I can't necessarily sue you for slander. Slander goes beyond just, saying mean things, hurting people's feelings. You're going to have to demonstrate a couple of things. And so in the New York Times versus Sullivan case, the Supreme Court basically added 3 prongs to this test. And the first is that it says what was said or what was written has to be false. So the first thing is that truth is the absolute defense. So, if what you say is true, however embarrassing, however damaging it might be. So let's say I do something wrong, you report that I did that, what that thing wrong was, and I lose my job. Well, I have real harm, that I've been damaged by your words, but I can't sue you for slander in that moment because what you said was true. So the first thing is that slander has to be false, which means, by the way, if it's an opinion, well, opinions can't be false because opinions are not factual. And so opinions are always protected by the First Amendment. So number one is that slander must be false. Number two is that there needs to be knowledge of falsity, meaning that what you said was not true and that you knew it wasn't true. So you said something that was false on purpose, knowing that it was false. And then third, you have to demonstrate that in that there's a reckless disregard for, the truth that's caused harm. And so, so again, proving all of those beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law is going to be very, very difficult. Another thing that's not protected by the First Amendment is obscenity. And one of the most difficult things is actually defining obscenity. I mean, pause for a moment and just think, okay, well, what is obscenity? And that's not easy to define. In fact, it's so difficult that one of the justices of the Supreme Court, when trying to define obscenity, actually said, I can't define it, but I know what it is when I see it. But that's not a helpful legal definition. Just to reiterate how difficult this is, and maybe to make you uncomfortable in the moment, especially if your parents are listening in, what if I were to ask you, what's the difference between art and pornography? Can you define it? If I were about to show you some images, there perhaps that depict the human form without clothing. There are images that I could show you that cost me my job, and there's images that don't. So when we talk, go through world history or those sort of things. I mean, I've shown students nude images in the classroom and I still have my job. And we would all agree, though, that other nude images would quickly cost me my job. And so what's the difference? I mean, what makes one obscene and the other not obscene? Can you define it? My guess is a lot of us are saying right now, well, I know what it is when I see it. I could tell you. But again, that's not a good enough legal definition. One of the first attempts came in Roth versus the United States, in which the Supreme Court said that obscenity was a work that had utterly without any social redeeming value. The problem with that definition is that we might be able to find some social redeeming value in almost anything. I mean, maybe the cinematography or the acting, had some social redeeming value. And yet we would all agree that in certain instances, the government should be able to limit my broadcasting of those images to people without their consent. Let's say I wanted to display them on my garage door on Halloween night. Miller v. California narrows the definition. And so, what it does is it defines obscenity as it's lacking a serious literary, artistic, or scientific value. And it adds to it according to community standards. So there's a community standard for obscenity. It's why the materials that might be handed out to you or you just find out in public on the strip in Las Vegas are very different than my guesses in your neighborhood. And that's because the community standard of obscenity is very different. Now that creates some other challenges in that, for example, like in the online world, like, is there a community standard for the internet? If there is, it's very low or non-existent. And there's other challenges. I mean, there's always challenges in defining things, to make you uncomfortable again. Let's, spend a moment and just talk about child pornography. Congress has passed laws trying to ban child pornography. Now, I hope we can all agree that that is a laudable goal. The problem, once again, is how you define it. One of the first definitions was so broad that it was struck down by the Supreme Court as being overly broad. I mean, it took certain things and made them against the law, which, in retrospect, maybe shouldn't be. For example, Romeo and Juliet. If you've read Romeo and Juliet, my guess is you were a minor. And my guess is your teacher did not introduce Romeo and Juliet to you as, hey kids, let's all read together this story of statutory rape. But by the way, the relationship between the, Romeo and Juliet are against the law and would constitute, statutory rape. And exposure to statutory rape by minors in school, was part of, this illegal activity in trying to, protect against the exploitation of children. Another challenge might be virtual. Like, what if the images are actually virtual? They're not actual. Like, there's no actual children. Should you be able to ban, those things? These are not easy questions, and they're only going to get more difficult in the 21st century. Another thing that is not protected by the First Amendment are fighting words. Now, this is difficult to define. I mean, the question is like, if your speech incites violence, if your speech constitutes a true threat, well, then those are fighting words. But again, what's the difference between, speech that might be offensive and fighting words? I mean, the trying to define what is a threat and a true threat is not always easy to do. There's other forms of protected speech. Censorship is very difficult for the government to be able to do. In fact, New York Times versus the United States, that's the Pentagon Papers case. The government ruled that there's freedom from prior restraint, meaning there are times when the government can restrict your access to information. But it is very difficult to do so. And furthermore, part of this issue of the doctrine of prior restraint is one in which you might be punished for what you say, but for the government to prevent you from saying it is something different. So for example, Edward Snowden, should he be extradited back to the United States, could be charged for engaging in illegal activity in order to release confidential information, which let Americans know about actions of the government, in which the NSA was kind of secretly wiretapping and spying on Americans. Now, again, he engaged in illegal activity to get that information, and he can be prosecuted for that. But what the government cannot do is prevent us from accessing that information. I can still go onto WikiLeaks, or I can go and have access to that information. And so the doctrine of prior restraint is this idea that, should information be obtained illegally, you can prosecute people for the actions, but to actually censor the release of that information is another thing entirely. And the government would have to have a very strong compelling interest. And that compelling interest cannot be a vague threat of national security, like, hey, this will be embarrassing, we won't be able to work with our allies, and therefore, it'll be more difficult for us to engage in foreign policy, and therefore the terrorists will win. I mean, that's just too vague. It's not a specific threat on lives or national security. Another thing the Supreme Court has ruled is that symbolic speech is protected. So the freedom of speech goes beyond that of speech itself. You don't actually have to say anything for the First Amendment to protect speech. Now, in Unit 2, we went over how Citizens United essentially protects money. That money used and donated and used for issue advocacy is protected by the First Amendment. In this case, in Texas v. Johnson, Texas made a law that banned the use of flag burning in protests. And the Supreme Court ruled that no, symbolic speech is protected speech. Hate speech is also protected. Again, words that are offensive are protected. Now, again, I want to remind you that the First Amendment protects you from being a pretty terrible person. So just because the First Amendment protects it doesn't mean that you should necessarily engage in it. The danger here is that, once again, how do we define the difference between offensive speech, hate speech, and fighting words? One is a threat, a true threat, a real threat. And the other might be offensive. And the problem, though, is if once you start banning offensive speech, well, then who gets to be the judge of what is offensive? Someone might be offended about anything. And then suddenly you get to this kind of slippery slope that over time you have no speech. And so we've tended to allow some pretty terrible speech as part of the First Amendment. In general, as a society, we've decided that the best way to combat speech that we do not like is not to prevent that speech, but instead to have more speech. So therefore, let's fight unwanted speech with speech. And then we get to schools and special places. Now, you might believe that you don't have any First Amendment rights in schools, but you do. In fact, the Supreme Court has ruled that your constitutional rights are not shed at the door. It is true that you have less. A school's educational mission can be used very broadly and construed in a way to narrow your scope of freedom of speech. But once again, the school still has to demonstrate a compelling interest. Now, again, a compelling interest to educate people. To maintain an educational environment does allow greater restrictions. Were I in a classroom and you decide to shout me down, and I can tell you, hey, you're disrupting my teaching, you need to be quiet, and should you refuse, when the school punishes you for that, they are restricting your freedom of speech, but they're doing so in a constitutional way. Were that same engagement to happen in a parking lot at a grocery store outside of school property, I have no more right to tell you to be quiet than you have me. I mean, we can't force that, and I can't punish you for that. And so again, schools are special places. There is an educational environment. But again, schools cannot do so arbitrarily, and they still need to have a compelling interest. Again, in the Tinker v. Des Moines case, the school had changed their dress code to ban the wearing of black armbands that were in protest. And this is causing fights. It was causing disruption. But in the end, wearing black armbands are not that disruptive to the educational environment. And it's not neutral, right? Like we're targeting specific speech. We're targeting, behavior. We're targeting, a message. The purpose of it is to actually prevent speech. And so, again, you do have certain rights. They're not shed at the door. And so again, hopefully through this, you've seen that number one, again, just a reminder that the First Amendment has a preferred position. So bear this in mind as we go through other rights in the Bill of Rights. As we talked about protected versus unprotected speech, all in the background is this idea that, there are certain types of speech that are protected and what are not, and what makes them the ability to not be protected is the government is able to demonstrate a compelling interest for their restriction. It's neutral in its application, and they're done in the least restrictive means. And again, as we talked about specific types of speech, you should hopefully see that there were tensions between social order and individual, freedom and liberty. The Constitution is full of these tensions, and we'll continue to talk about, the tensions between national security, social order, as well as, freedom and liberty, because both are important, but both can oftentimes come into conflict with one another. All right, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you later as we finish up the First Amendment on a different day.